Hi, I'm Dr. Mary Ella Wood, and I'm going to be presenting today on psychedelic medicine. I am currently a family medicine resident physician, and I presented this first at our conference series for our residency program. The reason that I'm recording this now and putting it up on YouTube is because I feel like there is a lot of stigma behind psychedelic medicine and what it all entails. And so I want to be part of demystifying it all and explaining what exactly we know, what is true, what is not true from what we know from the current literature. And I just want to start to get the word out there and to get people interested in psychedelic medicine and open to the idea of it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So our objectives. First and foremost, we're going to go over what psychedelics actually are. We're going to review their history, the discovery of psychedelics, what they were used for, a couple decades ago, why they were banned, and why they're now starting to resurge in medicine. We will review the neuroanatomy and physiology and how it relates to psychiatric disorders that psychedelics can treat. And I will say that this lecture is geared towards healthcare professionals, doctors, but I will try to break things down a little bit more so people who are not in the healthcare field can understand the science as well. We'll go over the molecular level and how this influences the mind at large. And as you see, we'll kind of start small and talk about the molecules first, and then go larger and larger and scale up until we talk about the mental disorders in general. So we'll review each psychiatric disorder that's currently being studied and how psychedelics can possibly treat this. We will go over the current clinical trials that are undergoing now, and we'll talk about what family physicians can do in the realm of psychedelic medicine, and particularly treating underserved populations or resource-poor areas. We'll go over what we can do for them. So we'll start with the history. So as many of us may know, mushrooms and other plant-based psychedelics have been used for thousands of years for both holistic healing and religious purposes. So these molecules aren't new by any means, and a lot of the developed molecules are actually derived from plant-based molecules as well. So these molecules have been around, they've been on our earth for a long time. Albert Hofmann actually accidentally discovered LSD, or known as acid, in the 1940s while he was actually trying to create a different pharmaceutical stimulant. He was also the same person who went on to isolate psilocybin, which is the active ingredient from mushrooms, in the 1950s. So during the 40s and 50s, these drugs were actually used to treat anxiety, depression, and other mental health disorders. That's why they were created. It wasn't actually until the spike in recreational use in the 60s did they earn their scary reputation. And how did they earn this? So a lot of different reasons, and we can talk more about this at a later time. But a big part of their ban was because people who were using psychedelics were heavily associated with anti-war movements. And at that time, our government was pushing the war and having psychedelics associated with these large movements of people didn't fit their agenda. So that is one of the reasons that people believe that there is this big push to ban psychedelics. It wasn't until the 70s that they were actually officially made a Schedule I drug. So to be a Schedule I drug, it means you have to have no medical benefit and a high potential for abuse. And both of those we will actually see is quite the opposite on both accounts. And we'll talk about that later this presentation. Then we get to the 90s and current day, and what is called the psychedelic renaissance began. So they were started to be used for research purposes again, legally for research. And in the past 10 years, and most recently in the past couple of years, research around these drugs has exploded. So that's primarily about what we're going to be talking about today. So before I get started, I just want to read this pertinent quote to set the tone for what psychedelics can possibly do for us. So this is a quote by Aldous Huxley. He's the author of a well-known book, Brave New World, and various others. He was one of the first people to write about and publish his thoughts on his psychedelic trips. He was writing this to Humphrey Osmond, who is considered the founder of the word psychedelics and was a researcher back in the day. The brain, with its associated normal self, acts as a utilitarian device for limiting and making selections from the enormous possible world of consciousness, and for canalizing experience into biologically profitable channels. Disease, mescaline, emotional shock, aesthetic experience, and mystical enlightenment have the power, each in its different way and in varying degrees, to inhibit the function of the normal self and ordinary brain activity, thus permitting the other world to rise into consciousness. So, what are psychedelics? Quite literally, the word psychedelics means mind revealing. And what we're going to talk about today are actually the classic psychedelics. So these are the compounds that act primarily on the serotonin 2A receptor. And the classic psychedelics are these four seen here. So we have psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in over 200 species of fungi. This is what is known as magic mushrooms or shrooms. And just a quick note, psilocin is actually the active ingredient that acts on the receptors in your brain, and psilocybin gets converted to psilocin when you digest these molecules. But for all intents and purposes, we're going to say psilocybin and psilocin are the same molecule for the rest of this lecture. Or we're going to speak of them as the same molecule because psilocybin just gets converted to psilocin. LSD is another classic psychedelic known as lysergic acid diethylamide, and it's known as acid. It is actually, that compound is derived from ergot, which is a fungus that grew on barley and wheat. We also have DMT, dimethyltryptamine, which is the active ingredient in ayahuasca, which is a ritual tea that's used in South America, very well known in Peru. Mescaline is the next one, and this is the active ingredient in the peyote and San Pedro cactus. So you can find these cactuses in the southern part of the United States and Mexico as well. And there are a lot of other psychoactive compounds that have psychedelic-like properties, but work a little bit differently. Most notable is ketamine, which is currently actually being used to treat depression, and there's actually a ketamine nasal spray that has been approved. And MDMA, which is known as Molly or ecstasy, which is used currently to treat PTSD as well. So these drugs work a little bit differently than the classic psychedelics, a lot of overlapping properties, but a little bit differently. So I'm not going to talk about them today because that would just be a very large lecture to cover everything. So today we'll just focus on the classic psychedelics seen here. And just of note, you can see the similarity between these compounds and their molecular structure and how similar they are to serotonin, which, as I mentioned, they work on the serotonin 2A receptor. So this is basically showing how they might be able to interact with that receptor. So again, we're going to start small, start at the molecular level, and build our way up. So first I want to talk a little bit about serotonin and its receptor. So serotonin is often simplified to be the happy molecule, and it turns out that's not quite right. We do know that in general, the more serotonin generally equals less depression, but that's not always the case for every person, and it's a little bit hard to determine if that's what's actually going on when we give patients medications to increase their serotonin levels. This molecule is actually a lot more complicated than just being equated to happy versus sad. So first I want to review how neurotransmitters actually work. So serotonin itself is not a neurotransmitter, it's a neuromodulator. And it causes the release of our two main neurotransmitters, which are glutamate and GABA. So glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter, and GABA is inhibitory. And for any neuronal reaction, whether it's the serotonin receptor downstream reactions or otherwise, it is the ratio of glutamate to GABA that determines what chemical processes happen downstream when a neuron is activated. So let's also recall that there are many different serotonin receptors. So the SSRIs, which are the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, Lexapro is one example of them, acts on the 1A serotonin receptor. Psychedelics act on the 2A. So the cascade that they activate is going to be different than if serotonin were to act on that receptor. And it's going to be different than the serotonin that is acted on the 1A receptors when we prescribe Lexapro to patients. Also note, when psychedelics activate these receptors, they do not cause an abundance of serotonin like the SSRIs, and they don't cause the release of more serotonin like MDMA or Molly ecstasy does. So they activate a completely different cascade. And again, depending on the ratio of glutamate to GABA that's released downstream from these reactions, that's what determines what actually happens when these receptors are activated. We don't have all these cascades fully mapped out. We don't for pretty much any neuronal reaction, but we do know that LSD specifically activates a cascade of reactions leading to the activation of 2 enzymes that are involved with the global improvement of mood disorders. Again, we don't fully know how, but we also fully don't know how an abundance of serotonin makes people less depressed, so to speak. And this picture here just shows a schematic map of the pathways that are currently mapped out. The different serotonin receptors are activated by serotonin. Of course, there's many more that are mapped out, and there are other molecules that act on these receptors as well. I just kind of wanted to depict how it's a little bit more complicated than just serotonin being the happy molecule. So scaling up just a little bit more from the neurotransmitters and the receptors, psychedelics, specifically LSD in this schematic representation, ultimately alter feedback loops, and specifically ones that filter through the thalamus. So the thalamus is the part of our brain highlighted here in this picture that regulates consciousness and alertness. So it's made up of a series of nuclei that are responsible for relaying different sensory signals. It filters sensory input and relays it appropriately in order to not overstimulate the waking consciousness part of our brain that's involved with cognition. So LSD actually alters these feedback loops that regulate what external stimuli is brought to our forefront of consciousness. Specifically, it regulates the corticostriato-thalamocortical loop. It's a mouthful. But less important than the actual name is that it dysregulates the regulation. So when this specific loop is disrupted, you get a sensory flooding, leading to increased sensory perception and the characteristics essentially of a psychedelic trip. In addition, it also causes cognitive changes and ego dissolution, which we will talk about a little bit later. So before I move on from the molecular level, I do want to touch base on the receptors that psychedelics and SSRIs act on. So we'll dive more specifically into depression later, but this talk right here is just going to be specifically on the receptors and the neuroscience. So SSRIs, as I mentioned earlier, which stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are the gold standard for treating depression currently. So examples of these drugs are sertraline, known as Zoloft, fluoxetine, known as Prozac, or escitalopram, known as Lexapro. So these medications act on the serotonin 1A receptor, thus ultimately inhibiting the reuptake of serotonin, hence the name. And what this does is keeps more serotonin in the synaptic cleft, thus stimulating the receptors for a longer duration. The downstream effects of this persistent stimulation is actually blunting. So it leads to reduced limbic responsiveness and emotional moderation. This sounds counterintuitive, but the reason that this actually treats depression is because it increases your resilience to depressive stimuli over time. Psychedelics, on the other hand, work on the 2A receptor, which, as we just discussed, cause different downstream effects. And ultimately, what has been studied is that this leads to reduction in rigid thinking and increased emotional release and environmental sensitivity. So the psychedelics increase well-being rather than decreasing depression like the SSRIs do. Scaling up a little bit further now, let's talk about psychedelics on the cerebral level. So I've broken down the mechanism of action into 3 main categories that we'll dive into a little bit deeper. So first, they increase the amount of neuronal connections in your brain. This persists after a psychedelic experience as well, actually. Second, they remodel or reset the brain from its negative cognitive patterns. And third, newer studies are actually showing that they alter gene expression in our brains as well. To give some context before we dive into all these different mechanisms and actions, I do want to just briefly touch on the brain networks that we have in our brain. So there are 7 major networks. Most of these are self-explanatory based on their name, and I'm not going to go over all of them, but I do want to focus on 3 networks that we will be talking about that are directly related to how psychedelics work and how psychiatric disorders arise. So the first one is actually number 7 on this list here, which is the default mode network. So this network is thought to be the actual physical location of the Freudian ego. So this allows us to integrate thoughts and ideas and is intimately involved with more abstract concepts. So it helps us reason and make personal connections that are important to us as I. So if you have a favorite color, for example, the reason you are able to have that color as a favorite to you personally is because of the work that is being done in this default mode network. Next is number 4, which is our dorsal attention network. So this network is constantly competing with the default mode network. So you can't really have both being activated at the same time. So this network allows us to direct our attention to stimuli in the external world. So people who have ADHD have a different balance between time spent in this network, i.e. they have less time spent in this network, versus the default mode network. Last one I want to touch on is number 6 there, which is our frontoparietal control network. So this network allows us to problem solve and reason. It is linked to intelligence and is what separates us from other animals. So this network is either going to be linked to our default mode network or linked to our dorsal attention network, depending on what we are trying to do. So if we are daydreaming or trying to integrate our day, this network is going to be linked to the default mode network. If we're trying to get work done and sit down and crank some things out, it's going to be integrated and connected to the the dorsal attention network. So why are we talking about all of these different brain networks? Well, because they relate directly to the entropic brain theory and how that relates to psychedelics. So we sort of touched on this a little bit, but just didn't put a name to it. But the entropic brain theory is the idea that we have to suppress the entropy or disorder of external stimuli and the billions of possible neurons that could fire in order to experience normal waking consciousness. And this suppression of stimuli allows us to interact with people and reside in an agreed upon reality. So for example, if you look out the window or look around in your surroundings, there is a bunch of sensory input that could be coming in and is coming in. But if you were consciously focusing on every single sensory input at once, you would not experience reality as it is now. And so our brains filter out things and only allow us to see certain parts of what is coming in with a sensory input in order to experience reality that would be the same as the person sitting next to us, theoretically. So the default mode network is the part of our brain that allows us to do the suppression and filtration and integration of what is important. Psychedelics cause a literal decoupling of the default mode network from the cerebral cortex and medial temporal lobes. So it sounds a little bit counterintuitive that you're not integrating as much, but actually part of the integration process, whether we're doing it too much or too little, is what causes psychiatric disorders and puts us in our own minds too much, so to speak. So when the default mode network is decoupled, these networks can function uninhibited. So the default mode network isn't causing them all to connect and process and integrate, and they're able to just do their job on their own. And this decoupling is shown to persist for at least up to a year after a psychedelic experience. And a year is just as much as that has been studied up to this point. So during an actual psychedelic experience, this uninhibited default mode network leads to the flooding of neurons, and particularly in the visual cortex shown here. This makes a lot of sense. We've all heard the characteristics of a psychedelic trip involving a lot of visual changes. So it makes sense that we have increased blood flow to our visual cortex. We also note a decrease in alpha frequency. So taking a step back, the alpha frequency is the band picked up on MRI between 8 to 15 hertz. So different frequencies of wavelengths are emitted during different brain states. And our alpha frequency is the one that's emitted the most during normal waking consciousness. So a decrease in alpha waves emitted, and thus other wavelengths picked up on the MRI, suggests a different layer of consciousness is emitting these brain waves. Interestingly, these different brain waves that are emitted during a psychedelic state are also emitted during mindfulness meditation and the dream state. So this is an interesting slide. Might be one of my favorite depictions of the increase in neuronal connections that psychedelics create. So this is a very interesting study, and I encourage you all to read it, and I will leave all the links to these slides and all of the resources and articles cited, so if you want to do a deep dive. But bottom line is, through a whole lot of work using a lot of biochemistry, physics, and functional MRI, these researchers were able to graphically represent the actual amount of increased neuronal connections that are created during a psychedelic experience. So diagram A is your brain during normal waking consciousness. Diagram B is the number of new neuronal connections that are created during a psilocybin trip. So this is during an active trip. What's even more fascinating than just the sheer number of increased connections is the fact that these connections are actually between hub networks. So hub networks that would normally function independently and compete for attention are connecting to each other. So this means more information sharing is happening between these networks, and these connections persist after the psychedelic experience has ended. They're not all firing at once like we can see in this diagram, but the connections are still there. They don't go away, for as far as we can tell, up to a year at this point. So taking it a step further, talking more about how these persist. So we have bench studies and we have clinical studies. The bench studies shown here, at least one of the studies, have been shown for up to at least 1 month, but the clinical studies have been shown longer. So we'll talk about clinical studies later when we talk about the clinical aspect of psychedelics. So we'll talk about these bench studies first. So this study is actually a study that was recently published this year, 2021, out of Yale. And they were looking at mice who were given a single dose of psilocybin. They noted immediate and long-lasting, 1 month, neuronal connections. And specifically, they noted a 10% increase in connections and connections that were 10% larger and stronger. These mice also showed behavioral improvements and increased neurotransmitter activity when subjected to stress. This is a similar study done in humans, and the circled areas you can see there on the brain scans, circled in yellow with the red dots noted to be the changes. These are the changes that persisted from baseline. And subjective effects noted with these changes were increased responses in reward learning, attention, and decision-making, as well as global increases in functional connectivity. So ultimately, all of these global effects that we discussed in the past couple of slides support a reset mechanism of brain remodeling for how psychedelics work to treat psychiatric disorders. So we touched on this a little bit, but essentially when the brain is too rigid or too loose, or filtering too much versus not enough, or spending most of the time in one network versus another, that's when these psychiatric disorders arise. And so the flooding and ultimately increased long-lasting connections that are made during a psychedelic experience resets the brain and rids it of its negative cognitive patterns that are associated with these disorders like depression and anxiety. This is similar to why electric shock therapy is thought to be valuable for some patients with treatment-resistant depression. Again, it's a little bit different because you're just shocking the brain essentially, and neurons are firing at random, and you can't fully control them. You can't fully control a psychedelic experience as well, but we do have more information about how the neurons are recreating connections and firing. So lastly, with our molecular mechanism of action, there's actually some newer studies that are showing that psychedelics actually alter gene expression as well, and particularly genes that are intimately involved with brain development, neuroplasticity, and cognition. I won't go over each of these specifics, and again, I'll link all of the resources below if you want to read more yourself. But you can see that each of these different genes are involved with different brain functions, such as neuronal expression, brain development, response to opioids, which is pretty interesting, and increases in neuroplasticity as well. The most notable one that I want to talk about, though, is the ARC. So this study noted a 5-fold increase in this gene expressed in the prefrontal cortex. And so this gene codes for proteins involved in the cytoskeletal makeup of the plasticity of neurons. So what that means is that further research could potentially lead to treatments for neurodegenerative diseases as well, in addition to psychiatric disorders. So just some interesting new studies that I wanted to bring up as well. And before we round out our basic sciences and biochemical portion of this topic, and before I move on to the more clinical stuff and how we're going to treat depression and anxiety, I do want to just note some more subjective effects that people have reported throughout these studies. Again, I'll link these slides and they'll be available to you, but I just want to mention a couple of them that I thought was pretty interesting. Most notable, people reported being able to see the world as if in higher resolution, experiencing synesthesia, which means feeling sounds or hearing colors, distortion of time and space, blurred lines between object and subject, leading to feeling at one with their surroundings or the universe, and understanding things at a higher level, but being unable to express with words because the understanding exceeds the human-derived filter of language. Now, safety. Very important because, of course, if we're going to be using these molecules to treat people, they need to be safe. And also, safety is a big reason why people are so scared of psychedelics. We've all heard the horror stories of people claiming to develop psychosis or schizophrenia, or jumping off buildings because they think they can fly, or staring at the sun until their eyes burn. And what we need to do is look at the objective facts. The truth is, and what the data has shown us, is that the amount of people who develop psychosis or schizophrenia after a psychedelic experience is actually less than the percentage of people who would develop psychosis or schizophrenia in general. So the data is just not there to prove that you can develop psychosis after a psychedelic experience. Of course, we cannot prove that it won't cause psychosis, but we also cannot prove that just doing anything won't cause psychosis, having a traumatic experience, all of these things. It is important to note that these experiences can be unpredictable, which is why when they're implemented to treat psychiatric disorders, people are pushing for it to be done in controlled settings with therapists and doctors. But we just have to note that developing psychosis or schizophrenia after a psychedelic experience has not been proven to be more than the general public who would develop schizophrenia. Other than that, physically, psychedelics don't have any effect on your actual body. They only work in the mind. So what do I mean by that? So unlike other psychomodulatory drugs like MDMA or cocaine or opioids, psychedelics have no effect on your heart rate, your blood pressure, your respiratory drive. And so because of that, you can't fully overdose on psychedelics because it only acts in your mind and it's not going to cause you to stop breathing like opioids would. They do not cause physical dependence. They do not cause psychological dependence. And in fact, actually, people report not wanting to do another psychedelic experience shortly after experiencing one. The toxicity level is almost obsolete. You would actually need to eat 3 times your body weight in mushrooms before they become toxic to your liver or kidneys. Now, again, like mentioned before, this doesn't mean that everyone should go out and take psychedelics recreationally or regularly, but we just have to look at the clinical data and not trust rumors that were put out when psychedelics were starting to be banned in the 70s. Also looking at this chart here, you can see that compared to all other substances, psychedelics are lowest on overall harm score, both to self and to others. So finishing up with the biochemistry and all the science behind it, let's look at the clinical stuff. What can we actually treat with psychedelics? We touched on depression a lot before, but there's actually studies out there being done for anxiety, PTSD, and addiction, specifically to tobacco, alcohol, and opioids. And actually in the 50s and 60s, when these compounds were first used, they were primarily used for addiction, which is pretty interesting. And there's also prospective studies being done for neurodegenerative diseases as well, like Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. So first, depression. We did talk about this a lot, but I just want to round out the clinical part of the trials that have been done. So controlled psychedelic experiences have been proven to improve cognitive flexibility, reduce rigid thinking, and disrupt the negative cognitive patterns that are associated with depression and anxiety as well. So this diagram here on this slide shows a more simplistic view of what we went over earlier. We kind of broke down each part molecularly, but here's kind of an overall big picture schematic representation of how psychedelics can treat depression. This is another study that I wanted to point out. Again, this study is using fMRI, and this study showed decreased blood flow to the amygdala, which in turn correlated with the reduced depressive symptoms. So recall that the amygdala is the part of our brain that's involved with processing fearful and threatening stimuli. So an overactive amygdala causes misregulation of the prefrontal cortex, which leads to the inability to cope with stress. The amygdala is also involved with cognitive bias, and overactivity will cause patients to interpret the world and themselves negatively. So these changes in blood flow seen here remained 5 weeks post-treatment, which is the length of the study. This is also a very exciting slide. So we have to do evidence-based medicine, and here we actually have a phase 2 double-blind randomized controlled clinical trial. So this study was a non-inferiority study looking at psilocybin versus Lexapro. So the results showed no significant difference, meaning that psilocybin works at least just as well as our current gold standard of treating depression. In addition, the psilocybin group did not experience as much anxiety, dry mouth, sexual dysfunction, or reduced emotional responsiveness compared to those who took Lexapro. So what about microdosing? I feel like this is what is being talked about most in the media, that you hear tech CEOs and all of these really intelligent people microdosing mushrooms. And what microdosing is taking a small dose of a psychedelic, usually mushrooms or LSD, small enough in dose that you don't actually quote unquote trip. You just feel generally happier, more creative, more productive. So there's a lot of anecdotal studies, or a lot of anecdotal accounts out there, but not a whole lot of studies. So I will say this is where the science falls short. The studies that we have out there now don't show that microdosing is any better than placebo for general well-being. Again, these studies are preliminary, low numbers, so there's more work to be done. But I do want to point out that at the current moment, microdosing is not shown to be beneficial compared to doing full psychedelic trips. And that could be for various different reasons. It could be for the amount of processing that happens during a psychedelic experience, and that this processing is done with therapists. So there's more research to be done in this area. There was a recent rat study, however, that I did want to bring up, which is shown on this slide, that did show enhancement of fear extinction learning without impacting working memory or social interaction in those rats that were microdosed with mushrooms, or LSD in this study. Now, addiction. What's interesting about addiction is that the studies that have been published recently are very small numbers compared to the studies that have been done about depression and anxiety. But back in the 40s and 50s, as I talked about earlier, addiction was a lot of what psychedelics were being used to treat. So I want to go over just the studies that have been done. Again, I will note very clearly that these studies have very small numbers, but their results are pretty interesting and would warrant more studies in these areas. So first, alcohol. So there's one study, 10 volunteers, that showed a single psilocybin experience significantly decreased cravings, and it was studied for up to 5 weeks. There was another survey study. They ended up pooling, narrowing it down to 205 people that actually ruled in for the DSM criteria for alcohol use disorder. And they noted in this this survey study that 83% of people noticed a reduction in alcohol use and actually no longer met criteria for alcohol use disorder. So for smoking cessation, there's a couple studies that are published out of Johns Hopkins. They're working on more currently as we speak. And they were able to show a significantly greater percent of abstinence of smoking compared to our traditional therapies. And when I say our traditional therapies, I mean nicotine patches or gum or other pills that decrease cravings that do not contain nicotine. So all of those are considered our current therapies. And so what they were able to show is that an 80% abstinence at 6 months and a 67% abstinence at 1 year. Now, this is compared to less than 35% efficacy of our current methods, which is pretty exciting, very exciting. Again, more studies need to be done. Also with these studies, unrelated to smoking cessation specifically, they were able to note a very interesting secondary outcome. So 80% of people in these studies rated their psilocybin experience in the top 5 of their most personally meaningful and spiritually significant experience of their lives. This was up there with the death of a spouse and the birth of a first child. So this just really sheds light onto how powerful these substances can be for people. For opioid use disorder, a lot of the studies are being done with ibogaine, which is not a classic psychedelic, but it is more in the category of a classic psychedelic than the other compounds I talked about earlier, like ketamine and MDMA. So these studies, definitely we need more, but they're pretty interesting as well. So there's one study that showed 75% of participants not using any opioids 12 months later. Another similar study showed 23% abstinence, so kind of a big difference, but very interesting that we have compounds that could potentially help people stop using opioids altogether, whereas our current treatments are more focused on symptom control and prescribing methadone and Suboxone, which are opioids. And this could potentially get people off of those substances, which could be groundbreaking. It could really change a lot of people's lives. So finally, we get to our current clinical trials. So if you're a doctor or a healthcare professional, what can you do for your patients now? So we talked about all these prospective studies that are being done. Again, LSD and psilocybin are not approved right now for treatment of depression and anxiety. MDMA and ketamine are for their respective psychiatric disorders. But what can you do for your patients now if you have someone with treatment-resistant depression like I do? I have a lot of patients that the SSRIs, the SNRIs, they're not cutting it. They're not helping. Patients are still severely depressed. You can help them enroll in a clinical trial. So I put a link up here that has a list of all the clinical trials going on throughout the world. Right now, there's over 1,000 clinical trials that are being done in the United States alone, more worldwide. I linked specifically one for Chicago because that's where I'm located and that's where I referred patients to enroll. But you can use this link and you can see what's around you. There's studies being done for depression, anxiety, PTSD, bipolar disorder, all sorts of things. So I encourage you to take a look, see what's in your area, see if you have any patients that might be a good fit to join one of these clinical trials if they're interested. Also, what I wanted to mention was Johns Hopkins Center. So they are leading the way in psychedelic research, and they actually created a Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, where they're studying, of course, as we talked about, the smoking cessation, all the other mental health disorders, but also just how psychedelics can increase well-being in general. So they're actively recruiting for a ton of different studies, and they highly encourage people to go up for the weekend, participate in the study, and then go back home. So this is another potential option at a very well-known and reputable center. So an option as well, and I linked there. Last, I just want to touch on our role as family physicians, or if you're another kind of doctor or healthcare provider, what is your role in using psychedelic medicine? So for family doctors specifically, I think it's our job to know all the options available out there for our patients. So we have to know a little bit of everything, and this is starting to become something that we can offer patients. So just knowing what's out there, knowing that there's alternative methods available for treating anxiety, depression, PTSD. On that note, I also just want to touch that this is, I would consider, part of an integrative medicine approach. And what integrative medicine is the blend of, what we consider Western medicine or modern medicine, which is starting to change. So there's all these Eastern medicine approaches, ancient medicine approaches that have been used for thousands of years before we developed our modern medicine per se. And we kind of have disregarded them because we haven't studied them. And some of them might work, some of them might not, but integrative medicine is incorporating more of that, if patients are interested, into medicine and knowing which is harmful and which is not. And that's a really important part of medicine. Also of note, especially for resource poor populations or people who don't have access or money to pay for expensive drugs or expensive surgeries, these quote unquote alternative medicine could do a lot of good and won't cost a whole lot of money. How is this going to work with psychedelics? I don't fully know, because mushrooms do grow out of the ground, but we've seen how marijuana has been illegal and then legalized and the cost of that. And so there's a whole lot of, this is a discussion for another day, but just something to think about. So I will leave my email address if anyone has any questions about this presentation. I do have a full list of sources if you're interested in reading more about each of the studies that I mentioned. And I just want to thank you for listening to this and being part of being open to what psychedelics can do and understanding that they're not as scary as they've been made out to be. So thank you again.